My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of Diplomatic Community. As always, I'm your host, Kelly McFarland, and this week we are resuming our 2026 Road to 250 series, which examines key inflections and turning points along the development of America's foreign policy and its identity in the world. Today, I'm excited to be speaking with Frank Cogliano, who is a professor at the University of Edinburgh. He specializes in early American history and the age of Thomas Jefferson. Among many publications, Frank has written Emperor of Liberty, Thomas Jefferson's Foreign Policy, which was published by Yale University Press in 2014. Frank, welcome and thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks very much, Kelly. It's great to be here.
And I already noted I was jealous that Frank is in Edinburgh right now. I'm a big fan of that city. So maybe I'll see you over there again sometime and I'll have some haggis or something. But
I'd like that very much.
Yeah. So those of you who were able to listen to our first episode in this series heard us talk about U.S. foreign policy during the Revolution, during the early Republic period, kind of going up to about 1800. That was our episode with Catherine Statler. And, this week we're going to focus more on Thomas Jefferson and what he meant for foreign policy, some of the policies he enacted, some of the issues he dealt with while president. But I think a good place to start is sort of where we ended last time. And that was, in many ways, talking about this sort of difference in America and their leaders, and particularly how they saw foreign policy. And, a lot of people, that listen to this podcast or watch it now on YouTube have seen Hamilton, I'm sure. And, there's a lot that goes on in there between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. So, this led in many ways to, these differences between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans or anti-Federalists. And like I said, a lot of this had to do with foreign policy. So, Frank, if you can kind of set the stage of where are we as Jefferson steps into the presidency in March of 1801, what is that sort of different foreign policy outlook between these two groups?
Sure. Again, thanks again, Kelly, for this opportunity. I mean, it all goes back to the French Revolution.
Mhm.
It's foreign policy along with fiscal policy were the two big issues that divided these early, we call them political parties, but that's a
Yeah.
little bit deceptive because when we say political parties, we think of modern parties. These are
Right.
more factions, but you probably dealt with that. But they've got very different philosophies and attitudes when it comes to the role of government in the economy, but crucially, given our topic today, when it comes to foreign policy, how to respond to the French Revolution. And to simplify a very complicated story, essentially, the Federalists believed that in the wars of the French Revolution, the United States should remain neutral, but sort of leaning towards Britain.
Mhm.
Whereas the Democratic Republicans or Republicans believed the opposite. They believed that France was, of course, a sister republic of the United States, that France had helped make American independence possible, and that the United States had an allegiance with France. And once France became a republic, an ideological commitment to France. And the Jeffersonian Republicans believed that the United States, while it should remain neutral in the wars of the French Revolution, should, where possible, lean towards the French. And so it's one of the few times in the history of American foreign policy where the kind of political parties actually believe in supporting different countries that were confronting the United States. And these are two great powers, of course, France and Britain at this point.
Mhm.
And they've got different orientations on that. So when Jefferson takes office in 1801, he's got a sympathy with France. It should be said, of course, the French Revolution has undergone some changes between 1789 and
Right.
1801. And of course, Napoleon's in power, and he's deeply skeptical about Napoleon at this point. But yeah, that's the setting the stage, I guess.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about Napoleon and the French Revolution and all of what's going on with France in a minute. But sort of looking at the macro again, as we talk about Jefferson, sort of setting the stage for some more specific things we'll look at. Jefferson famously coins this phrase "empire of liberty," and I specifically remember reading that book in grad school. That it is Tucker and Hendrickson,
Yeah.
I think, wrote "Empire of Liberty." But to our ears, you think of the terms empire and liberty, and they kind of sound like contradicting terms. And on the one side, you've got Jefferson, expanding American territory, obviously at the expense of native tribes, but also through the reach of federal power. But he has this small government ideal, right? So how does he reconcile these things?
Yeah, excellent question. So I'd say a couple of things. One is, and this always surprises people, and I used my book Emperor of Liberty as a
Yeah.
play on that phrase in a response to Tucker and Hendrickson. So I've used this language myself. Jefferson only uses the phrase twice. He
Okay.
writes about an empire of liberty, and he also writes about an empire for liberty. And if Jeffersonians really want to get down and dirty, we could talk about the difference between of and
Right.
for, but that's not
Yeah.
terribly enlightening. But in terms of your bigger question, how do we reconcile empire and liberty? He didn't have a problem with this
Mhm.
because he believed the United States would be a different kind of empire. So in this case, empire for liberty might actually be a better way to think about it.
Right.
That second usage, because he believed, in contrast to the tyrannical empires of the old world, and he's thinking primarily of Britain in this case, that abused the rights of their subjects. The American empire in North America would be something different. It would be a republican empire. Again, we assume these things are antithetical. He didn't. So the expansion into indigenous territory contiguous to the new United States was regrettable but inevitable in his way of thinking. The only way that liberty could be preserved in the United States would be as if the United States and this extended its republican model across Western territory and eventually, in his vision, all the way to the Pacific.
Mhm.
That would come at the expense of indigenous people, although he held out the hope that they could be assimilated as citizens into this new republic. And if they met certain conditions, how sincere that hope was is something we might get into. But he didn't necessarily, we see a contradiction here, but he didn't necessarily see that contradiction. And that partially explains, that thinking explains the Monroe Doctrine, for example, which is originally intended. I know this is something you'll probably deal
Yeah.
with later, and I don't want to go into great detail about this, but that thinking about reconciling republicanism and empire is common in this period, where there's a sense that the United States will be a different kind of empire,
Right.
and it will lead the movement for global republicanism. So when the Monroe Doctrine is articulated in 1823, it's about protecting republicanism in the New World from those old European-style empires. So
Yeah.
it's a new kind of empire. The empire for liberty, it's a good empire.
Right. And we'll get to this at the end, but I think that has a lot to do with the ways we see ourselves still today, and not calling ourselves an empire or thinking about ourselves in those terms. And this all goes back to 250 years ago. So I will come back to the Louisiana Purchase and the French Revolution in a minute, because I want to talk about Haiti, but
Uh-huh.
that's obviously very tied to why we were able to get the Louisiana Territory. But I want to switch focus here for a second and talk about something that doesn't come up very often, but that's the fight the United States had with the Barbary states during this period. And, Jefferson was weary of a standing army, but he didn't really hesitate at all to send the Navy all the way to the Mediterranean to confront pirates in that area. So, how does that and those actions there, first of all, kind of tell us about that a little bit. And then, um, how does that fit into this narrative of him as a leader, as a pacifist versus someone who's more active on the stage?
Right. Okay. Jefferson, an earlier scholar, described it as a halfway pacifist, and I think that that's kind of affected the way we think about him. Uh, but he wasn't that reluctant to use force. Both, he demonstrated that when he was governor of Virginia during the War of Independence, and certainly as president. And I'll talk about the Barbary War now. But to go back to the first point, because these two things are related,
Mhm.
the Empire of Liberty was predicated on certain assumptions that the United States would remain a republic of small farmers. Those were
Mhm.
Jefferson's ideal citizens because they were independent.
Right.
They couldn't be corrupted. He was worried about urban development, but he didn't want Americans to remain subsistence farmers.
Mhm.
He wanted them to trade their surpluses. And therefore trade was a crucial element along with geographic expansion to his vision of political economy and statecraft. And this is where the Barbary pirates come in, because what happened after American independence, prior to independence, the Royal Navy protected American trade.
Mhm.
After independence, the Royal Navy is no longer protecting
No.
American trade, rightly so. The
Yeah.
British say you're on your own, and the United States, and historically, powers trading in the Mediterranean had usually had to pay duties or pay basically ransom to the Barbary states along the North African coast in the Western Mediterranean. And if they failed to do so, those states might seize various powers' ships.
Mhm.
And so the Barbary states begin seizing American ships in the 1790s. The Washington and Adams administration negotiate treaties with them essentially to pay them annual tribute to prevent this. It's basically a protection racket. Jefferson refuses to do this. Uh, and what happens is whenever there's a change of ruler, and in the American case, a change of administration, the Barbary states usually took that as an opportunity to renegotiate whatever the arrangement was.
Mhm.
So when a monarch died, they would do the same thing when it came to European powers. So with Jefferson taking office, the Pasha of Tripoli chopped down the American flag outside the American consulate in Tripoli, which was officially a declaration of war. The Tripolitans interpreted this and intended this to be an opening for negotiations. One of the very first cabinet meetings that Jefferson had in March of 1801 was to discuss what to do in the event of in this event. And he thought long and hard about the constitutional requirement or the constitution that the Constitution vests the authority to declare war in Congress. He said, "Do we need a declaration of war for this?" And his conclusion, which might sound like sophistry to us, is, well, if they declare war on us, a state of war exists,
Exist. Yeah.
and therefore, as president, it's incumbent upon me to respond. And his cabinet agreed with that interpretation, including his Secretary of State, James Madison. And so the decision that they took at the end of March 1801 was, if there's a declaration of war, we will send the Navy to the Mediterranean to protect American shipping. And that's what happened. And the United States and Tripoli fought a not insignificant war between 1801 and 1805. Um, the USS Philadelphia, one of
Mhm.
the American frigates, was captured by the Tripolitans. The U.S. Navy actually, or the Marines, burned it in response. I mean, it's a not insignificant conflict. In answer to your question, his view when it came to the use of power as president was fairly flexible, and I don't think that's necessarily hypocrisy. I think what we find is people who become president, men who become president, often find their preconceived notions and ideological beliefs stretched by events, and they have to respond to those events. And so that was his response to those events.
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight too that we're in week 2 of the U.S. invasion of Iran right now, and discussions of war powers and things like that. This isn't something that just started, right? We can go back to the foundings of the country, and these discussions and these notions of what can the president do, what can't he do, go back to the beginning. And I think that's important to note. And one reason why we like to talk about history on this podcast, things that we call unprecedented a lot aren't necessarily unprecedented. So moving now to another issue, getting back to sort of because France looms large during his entire presidency, the Napoleonic Wars. Um, but one thing that is another sort of hypocrisy or dilemma that he has is the revolution in Haiti. Because on the one hand, you have Jefferson, who is, this guy that's backing these revolutions and was all in on the French Revolution, but a revolution in a slave island, where the slaves are rising up against their owners and overseers, and the French is seen as something else. So, talk to us a little bit about what is going on in Haiti, and what is Jefferson's reaction to that, and why is it important?
Yeah, so in the early 1790s, enslaved people in Haiti rose up against their French masters, and basically they overthrew French rule. And there was a very, very bloody war that ensued. The French attempted to recapture Saint Domingue, as it was then known. The British get involved as well because the French and British are at war, and it's quite a messy situation. Jefferson is, although he celebrates the spread of liberty around the world, he talks about the ball of liberty rolling late in life after his presidency. He's quite enthusiastic about the spread of liberty, and he welcomes the independence movements in Latin America
Mhm.
against Spanish rule. He is not in favor of this. And this is, of course, because Jefferson's a major slaveholder.
Right.
He enslaves at least 607 people over the course of his very long life. He's a Virginia planter. Um, Refugee planters from Haiti, French planters from Haiti, and Creole planters from Haiti come to America in response to the Haitian Revolution, and they bring tales of the bloodshed that happened there. And slave revolts are
Right.
the great fear of slave owners and enslavers in the early United States, and Jefferson is one of these. And so, although he has this belief in Republican government, small d democracy, and faith in the people that we see expressed in the Declaration of Independence, it's limited when it comes to race.
Mhm.
I alluded to Native peoples a few minutes ago. He's inconsistent on this question because he does believe that Native Americans are capable of assimilating into the American Republic. He believes that they're at a different state of development than European Americans are, but that they could become the equals of European Americans. He doesn't allow that when it comes to people of African descent.
Mhm.
He writes in the notes on the state of Virginia in the 1780s that he advances it as a, quote, suspicion only that people of African descent are inferior to people of European descent. He then goes on at some length uh, elaborate upon this suspicion. So he's got I won't say it's a blind spot. He's aware of it.
Yeah.
But he just does not see the Haitian Republic as legitimate, and he's worried about the threat to the peace and stability of the United States as a consequence of that. It's not quite a blind spot. He knows slavery is wrong. He writes eloquently about why slavery is wrong, but he doesn't have a solution to this dilemma. And as a consequence, as president, he advocates basically the economic isolation of the new
Mhm.
Haitian Republic. So he doesn't welcome the Haitian Republic the way he does in the early days of the French Revolution, the French Republic.
Right. And y- the Haitian Revolution then leads directly in many ways to the Louisiana Purchase. So, what happens with the revolution? Obviously, the Haitians kick out the French. And why is that important then for the Louisiana Purchase? And how do we get to that from this?
Sure. So Louisiana is complicated because at the end of the American War of Independence, Spain occupies Louisiana. France had prior to that, had claimed that territory. And Louisiana, of course, is a much vaster territory than
Right.
the modern state. It's much of the Mississippi watershed in the area west of the Mississippi River. Um, and when Napoleon came to power, he sought to revive the French Empire in the New World.
Mhm.
And that involved both Louisiana and reacquiring Haiti. And because Saint-Domingue, the Sugar Islands, are where the money is.
Right.
So it was worth there was a great deal of money at stake. And once Napoleon realized that he wasn't going to reacquire Haiti, he didn't necessarily need Louisiana, which he was going to use to supply Haiti,
Mhm.
and whatnot. And he also has to finance the war in Europe. So he looks to sell Louisiana to the Americans, to the United States. However, and things are complicated because Spain continued to occupy and govern Louisiana on behalf of the French. And the Spanish, of course, have their own holdings in North America,
Right.
particularly Mexico and all that territory to the west of the Rocky Mountains. And Spain was not all that keen to see the Americans acquire this territory. So
Well,
there's
they
a
can see
complicated,
what's coming. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And there's a complicated three-way dance that's going on here. The Spanish closed the port of New Orleans to the United States, to Americans in 1802, thereby cutting off American trade from the west of the Appalachian Mountains to the rest of the world. Those are Jefferson's people.
Right.
And so Jefferson sends negotiators and his ambassador in France, Livingston, to negotiate with the French to acquire New Orleans, the port of New Orleans. For reasons which don't need to detain us here, in early 1803, Napoleon decides to sell the whole thing for approximately $15 million. It's a very complicated transaction. And Jefferson is presented in July of 1803 with this opportunity to acquire Louisiana. However, back during the 1790s, when he was Secretary of State, he had opposed Alexander Hamilton's fiscal program, saying, hey, you can't do these. They're not in the Constitution. And he advocated for with strict construction of the Constitution. You used the word hypocrisy earlier. This is often held up as a moment of hypocrisy for Jefferson because he's not so concerned about strict construction when it comes to acquiring Louisiana. Say two things about this. First is, remember this vision of political economy of his. The United States must expand if it's to be a healthy republic. That means acquiring territory.
Yeah.
And this is a great opportunity to acquire territory. Secondly, he is concerned about the constitutional implications of this. As I said a moment ago when we talked about the Barbary War, he consulted his cabinet and said, what are my responsibilities here when it comes to declaring war? And they had a serious discussion about that. Well, in the summer of 1803, confronted with the opportunity to purchase Louisiana, Jefferson sits down. He's at Monticello when he does this, and he tries to write a constitutional amendment authorizing the purchase of Louisiana because he thinks he's sensitive to this criticism, and I think he took his constitutional responsibility seriously. James Madison, his Secretary of State, approaches him and says, hang on. Napoleon's a very temperamental leader who could change his mind. We can't delay. We can't go through this process of a constitutional amendment because the opportunity might slip away. So what Jefferson concludes, and Madison urges him to do this, but he takes this responsibility seriously. He says, well, if the House of Representatives allocates the funding, approves the appropriation to pay for Louisiana, and if the Senate ratifies the treaty confirming this, so treaty is required 2/3 of the Senate to ratify, then that, according to the Constitution, is pretty much approval.
Right.
He would have preferred a constitutional amendment, but this is where I think he's pragmatic rather than hypocritical. He's not ignoring the Constitution. He says, well, the best we're going to get is the House of Representatives appropriating the funding and the Senate ratifying the treaty. That's the best constitutional mechanism available to us to make this legitimate.
Yeah, because then you have buy-in from one of the three other two pillars of the Constitution. So
That's right.
yeah. So getting back to Napoleon, we have the Napoleonic Wars during Jefferson's presidency and beyond, but they're really starting to kick off. And it becomes, there's a lot of things going on during his presidency, but this one is probably the biggest issue he's has to face because of the actions of the British in response to trying to cut off trade and the continental system of Napoleon's on the continent of Europe. And he's really got to deal with this after being such a Francophile during his early period. And how does he start to come around to this? Because I want to get into the later part of his second administration, when he really pushes this economic statecraft as a substitute for war to try to keep the U.S. out of this, but to get back some of the rights that are being abused by the British and the French. So, walk us through a little bit up to the Embargo Act of 1807, and then we'll talk a little bit about that. How is he handling this situation, and kind of what's going on here that's causing him to have to deal with this?
Sure. The United States is caught between France and Britain.
Mhm.
And after 1805 in the Battle of Trafalgar, Britain, of course, is the preeminent naval power. The French are not able to challenge the British on the high seas, but France is a major land power, of course, mainly in Europe, although Napoleon's waging war elsewhere, beyond Europe as well, in Egypt and elsewhere. And the United States says, hey, we're neutral in this war. And therefore, we don't want any trouble with either of you,
Right.
but we
Yeah,
want to trade with both of you.
exactly.
And because so much of Britain's maritime strength is taken up by the Navy, the United States briefly surpasses Britain as the main merchant carrier in the Atlantic world, because there's a great American maritime tradition. As you know, that's why they got into trouble with the Barbary States. There
Right.
had been during the colonial period prior to independence. And so American merchant shippers take over the Atlantic carrying trade. And both Britain and France respond well to this in the sense that they say, you can trade with us, but you can't trade with them. And Britain is in a better position to enforce this than France is, because of the military situation in European waters and its dominance. And so this is going to put the Americans on a collision course with both France and Britain, but mainly Britain.
Right.
You factor in that, of course, there's a post-colonial thing going on here. The Americans and the British have a kind of very strained and strange relationship. They're very close in cultural terms, but they're also, the Americans are kind of trying to assert their independence, and the British don't quite accept or recognize that. And one of the other things the British are doing is stopping American ships to prevent them trading from the French, but also impressing sailors, taking sailors off American ships, including in some cases American warship, to force them into the Royal Navy, claiming that they're not actually American citizens. They're subjects of Britain. In some cases they were. And so it's a very complicated situation. But what we see is there's a lot of friction between the British and the Americans over this, more so than the Americans and the French. And in early 1807, there's a clash in international waters off the coast of Virginia between the USS Chesapeake. Again, this is an American warship, not an American merchant ship, and HMS Leopard, and several American sailors are killed, and several others were moved from the Chesapeake and forced into the Royal Navy. There's a great clamor for war in the United States in the summer of 1807, and Jefferson resists this. Now, you referred to his idealism about this. I have a slightly different reading of this. On one hand, he is somewhat idealistic. He believes in American economic power. He said, we are the number one merchant marine in the world right now, or in the Atlantic world right now. We do dominate the carrying trade. They can't do without it. He's also, remember, he came of age in the 1760s in the run-up to the American Revolution, when the Patriots used boycotts quite effectively to protest British policy. So
Mhm.
he is mindful of that. But I also think this is where he's a little bit more pragmatic than we sometimes recognize. The United States might have a navy that it could send to Tripoli. It didn't
Right.
have a navy that could take on the Royal Navy.
Right.
It didn't. So his options are actually quite limited. And my reading of the embargo, which is a disaster. So
Right.
basically, the United States says we're not going to trade with anybody. We're bringing our ships home, and you're going to suffer without us. And until you come around, we're not going to trade. This proves to be politically and economically disastrous. The policy doesn't work.
Right.
However, he doesn't have a lot of options. And I think what he was doing or intended to do was giving the country time to prepare for war and trying to get American merchant ships home so that they wouldn't be captured in the event of a war. So I think he knew the embargo. I don't think he was necessarily trying to remake statecraft so much as playing a bad hand. Well, badly, I guess, but I'm not sure what options he had.
Right.
I mean, one thing, and this is a challenge to get over to students, because they're used, we all live in a world where American power
Right.
is so manifest in almost everything. And I say this as somebody who lives outside of the United States. Believe me, we know how powerful the United States is.
Yeah.
That's not true in 1807.
Not at all. No.
The great powers are Britain and France, and the United States has to accommodate them. The United States is coming to this from a position of some economic influence, but basically a position of weakness. And trying to convey that is often quite difficult. So I think the embargo it's the only card he's got.
Yeah.
But he's trying to get ready for war, and the war will come
Right.
5 years later in 1812.
Right. And that's this is all good lead up to our next episode where we'll dive into the War of 1812 and the other issues that led up to that besides impressment and trade issues. So I want to get you out of here on this question, kind of bringing it more to the present again. And I know we've touched on how this is still obviously very relevant for today, but Jefferson looms large, obviously, in American history and today still in many different ways. But as far as his foreign policy legacy, how do you see that living on today?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, Kelly, there is a tendency to say, American foreign policy is either idealistic or it's about realpolitik, right? It's
Right.
either, hard-headed realism or idealism. And Jefferson's usually seen as the father of the idealistic strain of American foreign policy. I think there's some merit to that. I think the Empire of Liberty stuff that we talked about, he means that. And it's easy for us to be cynical about that because we see native displacement, we see the failure to do anything about slavery, and we say, yeah, okay. But I
Right.
think his Republican vision is a serious one,
Mhm.
and he's seeking a world of republics that are largely at peace with each other. I mean, it's the old, they're modern, liberal democracies don't fight each other, right?
Right.
I think there's an element of that in his thinking that's quite serious. There's an incident that occurs, or incident's the right way. He makes an attempt when he's the American minister in Paris to put together a coalition of weaker powers, of small countries, including the United States, and it's the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies and Portugal and other smaller European states to say, hey, let's get together and do something about the Barbary problem.
Mhm.
Because France and Britain just pay the tribute, or they occasionally go to war with them, and Spain, the great powers could do that. We, the weaker powers, should get together and try to solve this problem. And nothing comes of it because the other powers say, look, we don't want to alienate the French.
Right.
But I think there's a hint there of, I don't want to overstate this, multilateralism, a
Mhm.
belief that there could be a different way to do diplomacy. So I think that's one thing. So I think the republicanism is one thing that we need to take seriously. I think that aspiration to do diplomacy in a different way beyond the way great powers operate is another. And I think those are two important things that perhaps we we do see as Jeffersonian legacies. And the other thing is, I think he brings a degree of pragmatism to this. I think those years he spent in France seeing great power diplomacy and great power politics at work. Alexander Hamilton never left the United States after he emigrated or after he moved from the West Indies as a young man. George Washington went briefly to Barbados. James Madison never went abroad. The one person who in this period who had a lot of experience with Europe and European diplomacy and saw how the great powers operated was Jefferson. So where we see hypocrisy, I think I think we should temper that a little bit and think about pragmatism, because he's aware of the limitations of the United States. And he famously said, he talked about the American Republic. It wasn't meant to expand permanently. He said there are limits. He said, all we have to do is add Canada and Cuba. Okay. You'll talk about the War of 1812, I know. But with regard to Cuba, he said, ne plus ultra, no further. So he recognized there were also limits to, or there should be limits to American expansion and American power. So I think it's a complicated legacy. I think there is idealism tempered by pragmatism and a recognition of limits.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's important to note, because even these figures that we herald as the father or fathers of certain lines of thought, like idealism, perhaps with Jefferson, we see that that wasn't always the case, right? There was pragmatism, and that, putting these buckets in of idealism and realism or realpolitik is difficult to do when you actually look at it and you get into practice. And, we see that throughout American history. And I think it even with somebody who we think of oftentimes as this idealistic, father of that kind of school of thought. But anyways, Frank, I really appreciate it. This was good stuff, and it sets us up well for Mr. Madison. So I really appreciate it.
Excellent. My pleasure, Kelly. Nice talking to you.
You too. Thanks.